Hello everyone and welcome to Guild Wars 2 Daily. Today I think we might have a bit of a special episode where we focus on just one thing because there's a pretty big area of lore that's quite important to one part of the game that I feel like not many people know about, and it would be cool to actually go about it. And I finally had a question, so I figured, hey, why not? The footage is from someone called Joe Wep. I was trying very hard to use someone else's footage today, but he hadn't actually recorded anything in 720p, and despite the fact that I was going to let that slide, it's been insanely hard. I've been trying all night to actually get it to convert, so sadly I'm just going to skip on to the next person. If I get that sorted out later, we might go back, but yeah, so Joe Wep for the meantime. Many thanks to you for that, and there will be a link in the description if you want to check out the channel for yourself. Anyway, right, so the question that I've got for lore, and if I find myself answering this pretty quick, don't worry, we will go to another question, there's no problems there. But it was asked from someone called Perdristan, who said, here's a lore question for you. I was wondering if we knew anything about the War of Kryta against the Centaurs. We very often hear of Centaurs attacking villages as an example for dynamic events or even meta events, but we never hear of why they do it. I remember fighting some in Guild Wars 1 in the Shiva Peaks, in the Maguma jungle, and again in the Crystal Desert. However, they were very friendly with us in Nightfall. Are they pissed off at something humanity did to them, or are they simply very territorial? Now, you might be thinking Centaurs, oh, that's a boring topic. It's actually kind of interesting. Centaurs, I think people are starting to get a bit put off with in the lore slightly, because particularly before these betas came out, it was Centaurs that ArenaNet were always pointing to for every dynamic event. Oh, always Centaurs this, Centaurs that. Now, there is a lot of interesting stuff going on with humanity amongst humanity, so there's a lot of stuff of people who don't trust the Queen, there's a lot of people losing faith in the gods, there are people who aren't happy about the treaty with the Char, there are all kinds of things going in amongst themselves, but one of the main driving forces, one of the main things that you're going to be fighting against as humanity in the early game stuff in Guild Wars 2 is driven by the Centaurs. I mean, hell, look at it. If you create a new character, you will start the game. What's happening? A village very close to Divinity's Reach, right on its gates, called Shaymore, has just been attacked by Centaurs. It's been overrun. A lot of the event chains are to do with Centaurs. These meta events that go on around there are about Centaurs attacking fields and slowly bringing themselves to a point where they're powerful enough to take control of large places, like Fort Salma and like Beetleton as well. There's a lot of stuff to do with the Centaurs as a human, and they are in a very interesting place, really, because, and I'll come back to this towards the end, but I think that the Centaurs at the moment are in almost the same shoes that the Char were in at the start of Guild Wars 1, at Guild Wars 1's launch. And look at how much people love the Char at this point, just because we got a little bit more lore about them. To your question about why are they attacking, really, this is the crux of the matter. I could tell you specifically why certain types of Centaurs are attacking, but honestly, even though there's a lot of lore that I'm about to tell you about the Centaurs, the specific reason for why this one tribe that is really pushing this assault comes down to something very, very basic. But before we get into that, I may as well tell you how the Centaurs are actually structured. Centaurs aren't just Centaurs in Guild Wars in the lore. You don't just point at something and say, ah, that's a Centaur. Rather, you get very different types of Centaurs that band together, and it depends on where they live. There were hints in Guild Wars 1 that perhaps Centaurs are creatures that like to live in extremities. So in Guild Wars 1 we saw them in the coldest of places, in the most desolate areas up in the Shiva Peaks, right? Which is a pretty extreme area. At the same time, we also saw them living in the Crystal Desert, which is just as extreme, and also at the same time, even though we saw them in those barren places, they were also in the really thick jungles of the Maguma. So they were in these three places in the original game at launch, and each one essentially was known as a different tribe. So, I just told you about the ones that lived in the Shiva Peaks. Now, there are actually a bit of a distinction between this. As you might know, the Shiva Peaks in Guild Wars aren't just one mountain range. They're a huge mountain range. They extend from very far south in the world, really far north. And the way people identify the areas of the Shiva Peaks are you have the southern Shiva Peaks, which is really where the centre of Dwarven civilization was, a place called Drokna's Forge down there. That's where dwarves lived. And then slightly higher up, you had a place called the northern Shiva Peaks, and the dwarves also lived here as well. And in the game at launch, when Prophecies came out, this was all we knew of the Shiva Peaks. It was the northern Shiva Peaks and the southern Shiva Peaks. However, later, Eye of the North came around and the map was extended, and we saw even higher up past the northern Shiva Peaks to the area where the Norn live, right? And those were the far Shiva Peaks. Okay, and there are Centaurs living on the Shiva Peaks, but two different tribes, essentially. We seem to have one tribe that are in the northern Shiva Peaks, which didn't go by any name, and we also had a tribe in the far Shiva Peaks near where the Norn were, called the Modnir. Okay, that's Modniir. Now, the Modnir are interesting because these are the guys that come Guild Wars 2 are the main big bad group of the Centaurs. These Modnir actually end up taking control and essentially exerting dominance over the other tribes of the Centaurs in 250 years, and it's the Modnir that are pushing more than anyone else for the Centaurs to re-attack the humans. So really, it's the Modnir that are orchestrating most of the attacks, and they have risen to become the largest of the groups. So really, these are the main guys that we're not going to be liking in Guild Wars 2. So you had the Modnir in the far Shiva Peaks, but there was also another tribe in just the northern Shiva Peaks that were just called Shiva Peak Centaurs. We didn't actually know their tribe name. However, the guys from that tribe actually look exactly the same as the guys in the Modnir, so there are theories that they're all just Modnir Centaurs, and that's what's going on there, but that's not 100% confirmed. All we do know, though, is in Guild Wars 2, these nameless Shiva Peak Centaurs don't exist anymore, so for all intents and purposes, I believe that it was just the Modnir living in the Shiva Peaks. There's actually another tribe of Centaurs that lived in the Maguma jungle, those ones that lived there. They also didn't have their own name, they were just another tribe called Maguma Centaurs, and we weren't 100% sure what exactly their tribe name was or what they stood for. What we do know about that tribe, though, is they were going to try and form an alliance with another Centaur tribe, which is something that typically doesn't happen. Centaurs usually won't work with one another, and if they are working together, it's because one of the tribes is forcefully making that happen, as we can see in Guild Wars 2 with the Modnir ruling over other tribes. And we actually in Guild Wars 1 prevented this alliance from happening because they were trying to band up so that they could fight the humans back then in Guild Wars 1's time. Aside from that, though, there's very little lore about the guys that lived in the Maguma, and significantly less of the Maguma is available in Guild Wars 2, so that could be lore we're not really interested in for a short while. Then you had another group called the Dasari. These guys were way out in the Crystal Desert, long way away. Crystal Desert also is not available in Guild Wars 2. The Dasari are quite interesting though, because this tribe, when Nightfall came out, had all of their models updated to look like different Centaurs. That's because in Nightfall, most of our lore about Centaurs comes from here. You see, in Alona, this continent we're not actually going to be in at the start of Guild Wars 2, there were, a while ago, lots and lots of Centaurs, but humanity there attacked them and forced them into slave labor and essentially killed many of their tribes and forced them almost into extinction, to the point where when you're playing in Nightfall and you get to go to Alona 250 years ago in Guild Wars 1, there's actually only one real tribe left. These are the Veldrunner. And the Veldrunner, because you are fighting against the same people that are oppressing them in Nightfall, actually ally with you. So when you say here in your question, I remember in Nightfall some of them were friendly with us, those were the Veldrunner. They were the only Centaurs we really knew that would be allied with us, and it was through these Centaurs we learnt a lot about Centaur culture and the way that they live, and we learned just how intelligent they can be. Centaurs are incredibly territorial, as you state here, but they are also quite intelligent too, and they do have the capacity for speech, as you might expect, they are Centaurs. So, a few important things we learned about these Veldrunner. They are obviously only in Alona, and of course in Guild Wars 2 at launch. That's so far removed, it's very unlikely we'll see any Veldrunner. But this tribe, we did learn a lot about them. In particular, there is some very interesting lore about the Veldrunner, in that they have these customs about some things called the ancestor trees, which are essentially these giant trees that produce these sacred fruits that the Centaurs desperately want to look after. And they used to grow all over Alona, but there's like only one left that we know of come Nightfall's time. So it's actually quite interesting when you play through that and you learn a lot about that lore. There are a lot of theories to do with how these ancestor trees could have something to do with the Savari. Maybe these are different types of pale trees, or they are pale trees, it's just the Centaurs see them in a different way. But that's really the most interesting thing about the Veldrunner and the Centaurs in general. Really, if you want to get to know them, that all comes from those guys in Nightfall. So, we had in Guild Wars 1 4 tribes of Centaurs that we knew about, okay? They didn't necessarily get along with one another, they were very territorial, but they were intelligent. Lasaru in the Crystal Desert, unlikely to see them. Further south, we had the Veldrunner. When the Veldrunner were added to the game, by the way, the Lasaru's Centaur models were updated to look just like the Veldrunner, so you could say there's a connection there. Then we had the Modnir in the far Shiva Peaks, and a nameless group in the Maguma jungle. None in Kryta, though. If we fast forward to Guild Wars 2 time, there are now 2 new tribes that have appeared in lore that have been introduced. These 2 tribes are called the Tamini and the Harathi. Now, the Tamini and Harathi have barely any lore written about them, but these are the 2 tribes that the Modnir have risen up against and essentially are forcing to do their bidding for them. So these guys are under control of the Modnir, Tamini and Harathi. There's literally no other lore about them except for the fact you can observe in-game that the Tamini seem to be light armoured warriors and they're like the scouts and stuff, while Harathi tend to favour heavy armour. Past that, we really can't say very much. Not at the moment, not until we get an extensive period in-game where we can look and learn about a bit more of their lore. So really, it's mostly the Modnir. We haven't heard anything about these other tribes so far, though I would assume that there are still tribes that exist in Alona and in the Crystal Desert. Having said that, both of those places have changed significantly since Palawa Joko took over Alona, and since Zaitan rose from ore, and since Kralkatorrik went to the Crystal Desert. All these massive things are big changes to the world that could have made those centaur extinct by this point. I doubt they will be. So mostly we're looking at Kryta with the Modnir here. And they're in Kryta for a very, very simple reason. The story is, going back to what I said at the start, very similar to how we saw the Char in the game at launch in Prophecies before much lore was written about them. The truth is that when humanity came to Tyria, as I've explained in previous Guild Wars 2 dailies, and they spread north and they came to that continent, they went into lands that were already inhabited by other creatures. There were humans that went to Ascalon, and they drove the Char out. They assassinated, or at least they tell us that they've assassinated the Kan-Ur, and that put the Char into infighting and they went away. That's what happened to Ascalon. That sparked a huge war for the rest of time, essentially, up until this point, until very recently, where the Char wanted their territory back. There is the exact same story, though everybody seems to forget it, in Kryta. The same thing happened. Humans went there. Something was there already. Was it the Char? No. It was centaurs. It's the same story. The humans came, they pushed the centaurs out. Where did the Modnir go from their homelands? They went into the Shiva Peaks, and that's where they've been ever since, until recently when the Modnir have grown to a size, their particular tribe has grown to a size where they can get the allegiance of some other tribes and come and make a united push back against the humans. Does this sound familiar? Yeah, it sounds bloody familiar. It sounds just like the Char. And the thing is, with Prophecies at launch, that was really what we know of the centaurs right now is comparable to what we knew of the Char then, in lore terms. It wasn't until more expansions came out that we learned more about the Char, and suddenly everyone loved the idea of the Char actually being able to retake Ascalon, to the point where we now have a sequel, Guild Wars 2, where the Char are down in Ascalon and the humans are pushing out, and people are pretty much happy with that. They like that the story's taken that twist. So what I like to think of, and I like to propose, is that perhaps 3 or 4 expansions down the line, when, say, the Veiled Runner are back in the story, when these Maguma Centaurs are back in the story, when we've met the Dasari again, and maybe even these theories about the Sylvari and the Pale Trees and the Centaurs come true. Because don't forget, one of the most important centaurs in lore is a centaur that decided he wanted peace and he left, and he was Ventari, and he had a lot to do with the Pale Tree, the one we know, and he's a centaur. Is that a coincidence that there are centaurs in Alona that care so much about things that could possibly be Pale Trees, and up here in Tyria, the Pale Tree we know of was also cared for by a centaur? Is that a coincidence? But what I'd like to propose is that in 3 or 4 expansions, when all these stories have come forward and we've learned a lot more about the centaurs, could it be we'll be seeing people happy to see the centaurs retake their homelands, Kryta, just like the Char have retaken their homelands? Or possibly even, a lot of people propose the idea of centaurs becoming a playable race. Well, I'm not a massive fan of the idea. I don't think they'd fit 100%, but given all the similarities they have to the Char right now, I could see that happening. It's only a few steps away for the centaurs to be on the exact same essential story as the Char, although obviously a very distinct race with their own differences in among that. And you might think to yourself, well, no, that will never happen. The humans have already been pushed back everywhere. Kryta is their last land. If they lost that, then that's it, game over. Well, one thing I would like to remind you is that in both Alona and particularly in Cantha, humanity is still going, and especially in Cantha, humanity seems to be going very strong. So humans do have somewhere to fall back on, and that could happen. That would be a very interesting way for it to go. So yeah, the main answer to your question, why are the centaurs attacking the humans in Kryta? It's the Modnir. They have taken control of some other tribes, 2 new tribes in lore, the Tamini and the Harathi. How much more we'll learn about them, I don't know right now, but they are attacking because they want their homelands back, just like the Char wanted their homelands back, and can we really blame them for that? So there is some lore there. The Centaurs do have a pretty compelling story, I think, and a lot of the time it's ignored. People just think, oh, the generic enemies running in, fighting them. They don't have as much lore as some of the other races, but there is some pretty juicy stuff there, and sometimes I do have to wonder, are the Centaurs so wrong for doing this when I don't care so much anymore about what the Char did? See, it's only a matter of time before something like the Faux Fire or the Searing might happen in Kryta and we'd be in the exact same situation. Anyway, there you go, guys. That's my kind of spotlight on the Centaurs, a very big part of the human storyline. It's nice to kind of have that out there. I hope you learned something. There is a lot of really interesting little bits of trivia going on with the Centaurs, and I'd like to see kind of more lore be expanded on them so that they don't feel like such a generic enemy going into the future. But yeah, there you go, guys. I think next lore episode, I might start talking about the Dermond Prior in the Vigil. I saw some people asking about that, and that might be a nice idea to do some spotlights on that. But please do feel free to keep leaving your questions down in the description below, and I will see you tomorrow for mechanics. See you later.